There were moments during the speaker's battle where, when refreshments were brought in, I wouldn't taste them in fear that they might have been doctored in some way.
I'm looking forward to seeing Matt Gaetz-style populism really take hold in the party apparatus, in the establishment, in leadership.
He has no fear. He has no fear, and that's very uncommon in Washington today. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite of what we have in Washington.
Is it really in the interest of Floridians, Americans, to ascertain which guy in a tracksuit runs Crimea?
Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz is a firebrand lawmaker and conservative leader who is just beginning to flex his considerable legislative and rhetorical skills. This is national political correspondent Neil W. McCabe. Welcome to this presentation of OAN Investigates, Firebrand Chat, a conversation with Matt Gaetz. OAN Investigates sat down with the congressman while he was on recess from the Capitol here in Florida. He shared with us his insights into the political climate in Washington, what he's learned from President Donald Trump, and his relationship with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Gaetz is now in his fourth term representing his Panhandle district, but many Americans first heard of him when he led a band of reformers demanding a restructuring of House rules. The congressman told OAN Investigates, although there were raw emotions before the eventual election of California's Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, the process improved both the functioning of the House and forged the House Republican Conference into a far more cohesive unit.
I think that the speaker fight front-loaded the pain for the Republicans in this conference. I think we were able to realize that we couldn't go anywhere, that 4 or 5 or 20 people didn't want to go, and so we were all in the same canoe together. I believe that Kevin McCarthy is a stronger, better speaker today than he ever could have been without that speaker fight.
At one point, McCarthy came up the aisle to confront Gaetz, but now the two men are allies, just as McCarthy's strongest supporter in the speaker's fight was Ohio's Jim Jordan, the same man who in 2018 challenged McCarthy for leadership.
I believe he's able to go back to some of the corrupt special interests and tell them, I cannot do this for you. I will not do this for you. They will call a vote on the speakership and I'll be packing up my stuff if I do this stuff for you. And so it's made him very faithful to the country and to the conference, and that's to his great credit. And I also think it made people stronger who were willing to take a stand. I remember the threats that my colleagues got from their donors, from people who said if they didn't alter their vote, that millions of dollars would be spent against them. I mean, explicit political threats. And I saw their courage, and I was inspired by it. I drew strength from the way they responded to that for the country. I had colleagues say, I believe that these votes will cost me my re-election, and I'm okay with that because we've got to fix this place. Now, I think at the end of the day, people on the left, right, and the middle probably know that Washington is corrupt and broken deep down, and that putting those bad elements of the system on notice and giving us more tools to fight back against them is probably a unifying thing around the country.
Gaetz said it was all to make the chamber work better for the American people.
Well, during the speaker's race, I think that there were a lot of people who didn't quite know how to feel about something that they had never seen before. And that's an appropriate and understandable human reaction. But here's what I know after 3 terms in Congress. Washington is a deeply corrupt place. And far too often, the people who achieve major roles in Washington or leadership posts have to bend to that corrupt system. And that's not uniquely Kevin McCarthy's fault or any one person's fault. But where we have the leverage to send a shock into that system, I felt an obligation to do so. And so when I saw that 4, 5, 6, 20 people could shape the way that we proceed as a Republican team, I was willing to encourage my colleagues to join me in that effort. And there are a lot of people who watch that and say, oh my gosh, you did it. You got all these great concessions you achieved reform in Washington. And I would caution against that perspective, because the only thing we really did is develop a toolkit. Now, that toolkit must actually be used to drive reform. Now, there are a lot of tools in the toolkit. Some we talk about frequently, like the ability for any one member to call for a vote on the speaker so that the speaker can't put pressure on the membership to do what our constituents wouldn't want us to do.
They thought you'd cave at 5.
Yes, yes, yes. There are less celebrated features of that toolkit. Like now we finally have the ability to say, you know what? We can put the salary of any bureaucrat up for a vote during the appropriations process. Imagine if we could have forced a vote on Fauci's salary during the COVID pandemic.
The Floridian said the best way to understand the political dynamics inside the House Republican Conference is to look at the pending fight over raising the federal debt limit.
Let me use an example to crystallize the internal political calculus in the House Republican caucus right now, the debt limit. So we have to articulate a vision on spending that gets something from the Biden administration if the debt limit is going to be raised. And that can't be something that only 20 or 30 people want. It can't be something that only 200 want. We believe we have to have a 222-person strategy on the debt limit. And if we don't, if there's a chink or two in the armor, then Biden and the Democrats will use that to divide us, to confuse the American public on our message, and then ultimately, as Republicans do too often in Washington, there'll be a sufficient number that will roll over, that will cave, that will take a dive.
But there's institutional pressures to hold your that wouldn't exist if you had a 20-seat lead.
In a world, yeah, if we had, instead of 222 Republicans, if we had 245 Republicans, well then the debt limit fight would sort of be like the Rorschach test, where everybody could stare at the ink blot and see what they wanted to see. But now, what I have to understand is while I'd probably like to slash about half or all of the funding out of agencies like the Department of Education that are useless, moderate Republicans in districts where Biden won by 10 points, probably can't take that vote. And I have to be sober and realistic to that fact. And so I look at what would unite 222 Republicans in this debt limit fight? And to me, it's work requirements. I mean, the last time we had divided government and real progress, we did welfare to work. Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich did welfare to work deals. And Obama obviously came in and destroyed all of that when he was president. And so why don't, instead of juxtaposing Joe Biden to extreme MAGA Republicans, as he likes to call me, let's juxtapose him to Bill Clinton and say, well, gosh, if Bill Clinton was willing to work with Newt Gingrich on welfare to work, why aren't you, Joe Biden?
The son of a former Florida State Senate president said, a vital reform is how appropriations bills are presented to the members.
Separate appropriations bills. I know this sounds wonky and boring, but I get mad when I have to sit there and vote on a bill that funds the Department of Defense and the Department of Education, that funds the VA and the Department of Labor. That's nonsense. That's unserious. A serious country would individually evaluate those funding requests and would tweeze through expenditures that were effective or expenditures that were obsolete. I haven't done that in my whole 6 years. I've been up there voting on continuing resolution or omnibus bill, and it angered me. And so I wanted the chance to actually do real legislating, like I was used to doing here in the great state of Florida, and now we have the chance to do that. Another tool, bills have to comport to a single subject. Why is it that I had to take a vote on the Farm Bill and war powers in Yemen in the same vote?
Right, because if you vote against it, it's like, oh, you hate farmers?
Right, and you know, however one feels about the Farm Bill and about war powers in Yemen, seemingly we could all agree that those deserve their own dignity and their own analysis, and that now has to happen, and then amendments have to be germane, they have to be relevant to the legislation that is before us, and there's not a bottleneck on amendments anymore. Time after time, I would serve up an amendment that would be relevant and appropriate, and they'd just say, you know what, we're not considering it.
While House Republicans are as united as ever, there are still disagreements over U.S. policy in Ukraine, with Gaetz in the camp of the skeptics.
Seeing Joe Biden in Ukraine on President's Day was deflating to a lot of Americans. I don't think people were angry or sad as much as they just were deflated, because we do have challenges in America that require a focused president. And maybe if every other day on the job we had an energetic, focused, driven president, this wouldn't seem so bad. But when our fellow Americans see Joe Biden distant to the challenges and concerns that our people have, and yet so attentive to this conflict oceans away, it feels like we don't matter as much. And Americans don't deserve that feeling, and I think they're particularly aggrieved when we go through that with an American president.
While the Senate's only power is to say no, the framers gave the House the initiative in matters of war and money, and the congressman wants to reassert both prerogatives.
I don't think we should send one more dollar to Ukraine. We've sent over $100 billion. I think this problem has to be resolved by Europe. We sort of seem like dead money at the global stage when we fork over billion after billion, and Germany continues to buy Russian energy. Russia is now being bought out in a lot of ways by the Chinese Communist Party if you look at farmland and other assets in Russia. And I don't think that our contribution is drawing this conflict to an end. That's really the human cost. These images of carnage and innocents being slaughtered tug at the heartstrings of every American. But do we really think that sending billions more to Ukraine is going to make that conflict end sooner? If this is a model for anything in the future, it might be a model for more grift. We think about Afghanistan and the way in which our participation in that war and our efforts at rebuild led to a whole lot of money sloshing around in foreign bank accounts. In Afghanistan, we paid off the warlords instead of advancing democracy. In Ukraine, we seem to be paying off the oligarchs instead of pushing for peace. And so the corollaries are striking, and one has to wonder what foreign banks are going to see the great bounty of the Ukraine grift, saying that the ultimate goal is to topple Putin. And when you are unable to define victory, we have seen throughout my whole life that it becomes very difficult to attain.
Michael Caputo is the Chief Communications Officer for the Miami-based Americano Media. He also served as a senior official in the Trump administration and 2016 campaign. Caputo told OAN Investigates when Gaetz first joined Congress in 2017, he did not know what to expect.
Well, I'll tell you, Congressman Gaetz, I didn't know what to think of him when he first came to Congress. I mean, people were trying to spin the idea that he's a spoiled rich boy and all these other things. But I started looking into it and I understood this is a man who certainly had what it took to serve. But he has no fear. He has no fear. And that's very uncommon in Washington today. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite of what we have in Washington. And I think that there's a very strong contingent in our capital city who are trying very hard to reject him. You don't have to look any further than what the deep state did to him on these allegations.
The Buffalo native and Trump confidant said Gaetz has learned all the right lessons from the president.
It's true. You know, President Trump truly enjoys working with people who remind him of himself. You know, people who work without fear, who don't necessarily need a net if they're walking the tightrope. And Congressman Gaetz is definitely that kind of guy. In the end, I suspect when history writes who was with Trump and who was against him, Gaetz will be at the top of that list.
Caputo learned about the deep state when he was investigated and smeared during the height of the Russian collusion hoax, and later when he battled political doctors inside the federal government as the Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Army veteran said Gaetz was being targeted for a reason.
You know, it hasn't been entirely positive for him, but it hasn't made him afraid to speak his mind. From my perspective, the more Gaetz we have in the United States House of Representatives, the better off our country is. But also from the deep state's perspective, they believe the opposite. They clearly want him gone.
In March 2021, President Joe Biden's Justice Department leaked to the New York Times that Gaetz was being investigated for transporting a minor across state lines for immoral purposes. Typical of the smear and frame-up campaign against Gaetz were the comments from former Vice President Mike Pence's closest advisor, Mark Short, who told CNN he expected the congressman to be behind bars.
Well, I don't know if Mike Pence will run for president in 2024, but I don't think Matt Gaetz will have an impact on that. In fact, I'd be surprised if he was still voting. It's more likely he'll be in prison for child sex trafficking by 2024. And I'm actually surprised that Florida law enforcement still allows him to speak to teenage conferences like that. So I'm not too worried about Matt Gaetz, thanks.
In February 2023, 6 months after investigators told federal prosecutors there was no case, the Justice Department told Gaetz he was no longer in their crosshairs.
I learned so much during the Mueller investigation about how the deep state will use the process to be a punishment unto itself. That most people think about the justice system as one where there's an allegation and then there has to be evidence and there's an opportunity to test the veracity of that evidence, and then we reach a conclusion that society can live with. But that wasn't really the goal of the Mueller investigation. The goal was just to smear Trump.
Where's Matt Gaetz? I heard his speech. Oh, Matt, look at Matt. Boy. Well, they weaponized him, too. They weaponized him. They made up phony charges, and he went through 2 years of hell, and he turned out to be a brave guy. It is a good test. You have to say that, Matt. It's a hell of a test. We learn about people. It's almost like going to school.
And there were definitely days when I felt like that's what they were trying to do to me as well. Whether it was the media or people even in our own government, they tried to dress up these horrendous allegations and then apply them to me, even though that wasn't reflective of my conduct at all. And there are times you say, gosh, I wish I had that day in court. I wish I had the chance.
Instead of packing it in, the congressman went on the road.
I didn't go into hiding. I went on tour. I didn't resign my seat in Congress. I felt ever the more determined to vindicate the choice that the voters of this district had made to allow me to serve as their representative. So, Neil, it was not the most comfortable year of my life as I reflect on it, but undeniably it made me stronger, and it exposed the tools that are often used against people who go against the grain. You know, that was kind of the magic of Trump. Even though he seemed to draw all these crazy allegations, he always found a way to use that to expose broader problems that affected regular folks.
Gavin Wax is the president of the New York Young Republicans Club. Wax told OAN Investigates Gaetz has a national fan base, especially in blue states, behind enemy lines.
I consider Congressman Gaetz a good friend. I think he's an inspirational political figure. He has demonstrated an ability to get results for not only his constituents in Florida, but for conservatives nationwide. He has been a populist conservative leader in the House, and it's something we've desperately needed from the Republican Party, and he has delivered it. What he did with his merry band of dissenters during the leadership fight generated results for conservatives that we have been waiting decades to achieve. He sets the narrative, he punches back firmly against the left's media narrative, and he is allowing us to create an environment where other Firebrand-style populists can emerge nationwide.
Gaetz also proves that conservatives can win, Wax said.
I think Congressman Matt Gaetz shows that you can be cool and a Republican, that you don't have to sacrifice any of your principles to be an electoral juggernaut. He's an electoral juggernaut in his district, and I think he has a massive national appeal. I think he has a statewide appeal in Florida, and he has not had to sacrifice any principles. And this is a courageous guy. I mean, he was willing to buck his own party when necessary. He is a man who is firmly committed to his beliefs and principles. He stands firm on them, and it achieves results. He has a massive following. I mean, he is a media personality. He's a media sensation. He could pack out rooms in any part of the country. So it just goes to show that if people are willing to take the path that Congressman Matt Gaetz has taken, they will also achieve political and electoral success. So even acting out of their own self-interest, it would be beneficial for them. But obviously it is the principled route to take, where you're not sacrificing anything and you're fighting tooth and nail to get what you believe needs to get done.
The left now routinely uses the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies to harass and suppress dissent. Gaetz told OAN Investigates what he's going to do about it while he sits on the Weaponization of the Federal Government Subcommittee, chaired by his ally, Jim Jordan.
The most important tool that I think we've developed in this toolkit is the special subcommittee on the weaponization of government against our people. And we see in the headlines, and OAN has covered it extensively, how the FBI and the Department of Justice have been weaponized, and there's a lot of work to do there. But it's not just them. I think about all of the lists that our government makes of our fellow Americans. You know, the CDC is working on building lists of the unvaccinated. The ATF is creating lists of firearm transactions that are otherwise entirely legal. The DOD makes lists of service members. I don't want to just look at the Department of Justice. I mean, even the post office has a covert surveillance program to monitor people's political expressions online. Jim Jordan is certainly a guy who can help lead that effort, and if he's Batman, I'm going to be the Robin to his Batman, right along his side and serving the cause in that manner.
Gaetz said he is prepared for this moment.
My analysis and my work and my research in the upcoming 2 years will be focused on common practices across the enterprise of government that infringe on people's liberties and that exceed the authority that we've actually given to these agencies. They really do become like Frankenstein's monster, and they begin doing things beyond what Congress ever envisioned or what Congress ever authorized. And so we're going to be looking at surveillance, intelligence collection, list building, and then the use of regulatory action to try to crush people. And we see that at the EPA, we see that at the Department of Labor, we see that at OSHA. And the challenge, Neil, is that you almost feel like a mosquito at a nudist colony because it's a target-rich environment everywhere, and we have to focus on some of those specific things. And the way it has to manifest in divided government is the power of the purse.
Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz is a man on the rise, exercising real power on Capitol Hill. But his enemies in the media and the government continue to try to stop him. But he will not quit. He has only just begun.
I'm looking forward to seeing the future Matt Gaetz generation of Republicans emerging across the country. I'm looking forward to seeing Matt Gaetz-style populism really take hold in the party apparatus, in the establishment, in leadership. And I think with that sort of energy, with that sort of principled commitment to our ideological viewpoints, we will have generational control as the Republican Party. We need to follow the Matt Gaetz example.
Thank you for joining us for this presentation of OAN Investigates, Firebrand Chat, a conversation with Matt Gaetz. Reporting for One American News, Neil W. McCabe.